Grace Timmons had always believed in the power of small gestures. A 27-year-old aspiring artist, she lived in a modest apartment in the quiet Willow Lane neighborhood. Her life was far from glamorous. Between juggling shifts at a local cafe and spending evenings sketching designs she hoped might one day fund her dreams, Grace had little time or money to spare. But she had a heart as big as the sky, and that was what truly mattered to her. One chilly autumn morning, as Grace carried her groceries up the stairs, she noticed Mrs. Eleanor Jensen, the elderly woman who lived a few doors down, struggling to unlock her door. Eleanor was in her late 70s, frail but always wearing a warm smile when they crossed paths. Grace had often wondered how she managed alone in her large, old house. "Mrs. Jensen, do you need a hand?" Grace called out, setting her grocery bag down. Eleanor turned, her face lighting up with relief. "Oh, Grace, yes, thank you, dear. These keys always seem to have a mind of their own." Grace took the keys, jiggled them slightly, and the door creaked open. Inside, a faint scent of dust and lavender lingered in the air. The entryway, once elegant with its vintage furniture, showed signs of neglect. A thin layer of dust coated the surfaces, and the floors needed sweeping. "Thank you so much," Eleanor said. "You're such a kind young lady." "Anytime, Mrs. Jensen," Grace replied. She hesitated, then added gently, "If you ever need help with anything, don't hesitate to ask." Eleanor smiled but looked away. "Well, now that you mention it." She trailed off, wringing her hands nervously. "It's a bit embarrassing, but my house has gotten away from me. I haven't been able to keep up with the cleaning, and I didn't know who to call for help. Would you mind? I'd pay you, of course." Grace waved her hand. "Oh, don't worry about paying me. I'd be happy to help." Over the next few days, Grace carved out time to assist Eleanor. She started small, tackling one room at a time. The kitchen, with its stacks of unwashed dishes and cluttered countertops, was the first challenge. As Grace worked, Eleanor sat at the table, sharing stories about her late husband and their many adventures during their younger years. Grace learned that Eleanor had once been a schoolteacher, her life filled with books, laughter, and an endless stream of students who adored her. "You must have so many memories in this house," Grace said as she scrubbed the countertops. "Oh yes," Eleanor replied with a wistful smile. "It's been my home for over 40 years. It's just harder to keep up with now that I'm on my own." Day by day, Grace's presence became a comfort to Eleanor, and Eleanor's stories became a source of inspiration for Grace. They laughed over tales of mischievous students and shared quiet moments over cups of tea. As Grace cleaned, she noticed little things: beautiful porcelain figurines displayed on dusty shelves, a collection of antique clocks, and a stack of unopened mail on the coffee table. She never asked questions about Eleanor's finances or personal matters. To her, this was simply an opportunity to help a neighbor in need. But life wasn't easy for Grace. Between her cafe shifts, her art projects, and the cleaning, she often found herself exhausted. She'd sometimes catch herself daydreaming about what it would be like to have more stability, a steady job that didn't leave her scrambling to pay rent, or enough time to truly focus on her art. Still, she never once considered giving up on helping Eleanor. There was something deeply fulfilling about seeing the home slowly transform. The dust was swept away, the windows began to sparkle, and the old furniture regained its charm. One afternoon, as Grace was organizing Eleanor's bookshelves, she came across a faded leather-bound journal. It looked out of place amidst the neatly arranged books. "Oh my goodness," Eleanor said, her eyes widening. "I haven't seen that in years. That was my husband's. He loved to jot down all sorts of things: ideas, plans, even dreams." Grace handed it to her carefully. "Would you like me to put it somewhere special?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Yes, please. It's one of the few things that really remind me of him." As the first weeks of cleaning drew to a close, Grace realized that this experience was about more than just tidying up a house. It was about connection, stories, and the quiet beauty of helping someone reclaim their space and a part of themselves. Eleanor's gratitude grew with each passing day, but she also seemed to be hiding something. There was a quiet hesitation in her words, a secret she wasn't quite ready to share. Grace didn't push. For now, it was enough to see Eleanor smile. Little did she know, her kindness was about to change her life in ways she never imagined. As the days turned into weeks, Grace and Eleanor settled into a comfortable routine. Grace would arrive mid-morning, often bringing a small treat from the cafe, a warm muffin, or a slice of pie before diving into her cleaning. Eleanor, always grateful, would sit nearby, occasionally attempting to help but mostly regaling Grace with stories from her past. The living room was the next big project. The faded curtains hung limply, the once vibrant rug was now muted under years of dirt, and an old piano sat in the corner, its keys covered in a film of dust. Grace rolled up her sleeves and got to work. "Do you play?" she asked, gesturing toward the piano. "Oh, not anymore," Eleanor replied. "But I used to. I played for my students during music hour. My husband adored the sound. He'd always ask me to play after dinner." Grace smiled. "Maybe once we've cleaned it up, you'll feel inspired to play again." Eleanor chuckled. "We'll see, dear." The two women worked side by side that day, Eleanor polishing a few trinkets while Grace tackled the heavier tasks. Grace couldn't help but notice the care Eleanor showed as she dusted a small, framed photograph of a young couple, Eleanor and her husband, on their wedding day. "Your husband looks so dashing," Grace remarked. "Oh, he was," Eleanor said with a nostalgic sigh. "And kind, too. He was always helping others, just like you." Grace blushed, brushing off the compliment. "I'm just glad I can help. This house has so much charm, it deserves to shine again." As the room came together, Grace unearthed forgotten treasures. There was a box of handwritten letters tied with a ribbon, a small collection of vintage brooches, and a set of crystal candlesticks tucked away in the corner cabinet. "You have so many beautiful things," Grace said, admiring a delicate porcelain vase. "Most of it's just been sitting here, collecting dust," Eleanor said. "Sometimes I think about selling some of it, but it's hard to part with memories." Grace nodded. She understood the sentiment. Her own apartment was filled with sketches she couldn't bear to throw away, even if they hadn't turned out quite right. One day, as Grace was scrubbing the fireplace, Eleanor came in holding an envelope. She hesitated for a moment before handing it to Grace. "I found this in the mail pile," Eleanor said. "It's addressed to me, but I don't remember sending for anything like it." Grace wiped her hands on a rag and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter from a law firm, dense with legal language. At first it didn't make sense, but as she read further, her eyes widened. "Mrs. Jensen," Grace said slowly, "this says you have unclaimed assets from your late husband's estate. A significant amount, it seems." Eleanor looked confused. "Unclaimed assets? That doesn't sound right. My husband was always so thorough with our finances." Grace set the letter down. "It could be worth looking into. I could help you call the firm if you'd like." Eleanor hesitated but eventually nodded. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to ask." Over the next few days, Grace helped Eleanor make sense of the situation. She made phone calls, filled out forms, and even drove Eleanor to an appointment at the law office. Throughout it all, Eleanor insisted it was likely a mistake or a minor matter. "It's probably just a few old stocks or bonds," Eleanor said dismissively. Grace didn't press the issue. To her, helping Eleanor navigate the process was simply another way to give back. In the meantime, the cleaning continued. The house was starting to feel warm and inviting again. Sunlight streamed through the now pristine windows, and the freshly polished furniture gleamed. The piano, with its ivory keys wiped clean, stood proudly in the corner of the living room. One evening, as Grace prepared to leave, Eleanor placed a hand on her arm. "Grace," she said softly, "you've done more for me than I could have ever imagined. This house feels like a home again because of you." Grace smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Mrs. Jensen." I'm just glad I could help. As Grace walked back to her apartment that night, she felt a warmth in her chest that had little to do with the crisp autumn air. Despite her own struggles, she felt deeply fulfilled. Helping Eleanor wasn't just about cleaning a house. It was about rebuilding a life, one dusted corner at a time. But beneath the surface, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's story was far from over. There was something waiting to be uncovered, something that might change everything. As Grace continued her work in Eleanor's home, their bond deepened. Grace noticed how Eleanor seemed lighter each day, her steps less hesitant, and her laughter more frequent. The house, once a shadow of its former self, now radiated warmth and life. Eleanor's gratitude was evident, but she remained a modest woman. She insisted on giving Grace small tokens of appreciation: a knitted scarf, a tin of cookies, or a stack of art supplies she had found in her attic. "These belonged to one of my former students," Eleanor explained one afternoon, holding out a box of sketch pads and pencils. "I thought you might make better use of them." Grace was touched. The supplies were simple but felt like a treasure trove. "Thank you, Mrs. Jensen. I'll use these for my next designs." Eleanor beamed. "I'd love to see your work sometime. You've been so good to me. It's the least I can do." While their days were filled with cleaning and laughter, the matter of the unclaimed assets lingered in the background. Grace helped Eleanor send in the necessary documents, but neither of them thought much would come of it. One crisp morning, as Grace was scrubbing the tiles in the bathroom, Eleanor called out from the hallway. "Grace, dear, could you come here for a moment?" Grace wiped her hands and followed Eleanor's voice to the kitchen, where she found her standing with a thick envelope in her hands. "It's from the law firm," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. Grace sat down with her at the table. "Would you like me to read it?" Eleanor nodded, handing her the envelope. Inside was a detailed letter, accompanied by several legal documents. As Grace skimmed the pages, her heart began to race. "Mrs. Jensen," she said slowly, "this says your husband left behind significant investments that have grown over the years. Stocks, real estate holdings. It's all here." Eleanor blinked in disbelief. "I had no idea. He never mentioned any of this to me." Grace continued reading. "It seems the total value is substantial." She hesitated, unsure how to break the news. "Over $1 million, Mrs. Jensen." Eleanor gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. $1 million? That can't be right." "It's all detailed here," Grace said, sliding the papers across the table. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. "I never needed much," she murmured. "After he passed, I just lived on my pension and savings. I never even thought to check for anything more." The revelation was overwhelming for both of them. For Eleanor, it was a reminder of her husband's foresight and the life they had built together. For Grace, it was a glimpse into a world she had never imagined, a world of possibility, untouched by the daily grind of bills and responsibilities. But Eleanor's reaction was not one of excitement. Instead, it was quiet reflection. "Money doesn't change the things that matter most," she said softly. "I'm grateful, of course, but it's the memories I have of him that are priceless." Over the next few days, Grace helped Eleanor navigate the paperwork to claim the funds. Eleanor was adamant about keeping her newfound wealth private. "I don't want anyone treating me differently," she said. Grace admired Eleanor's humility but couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have even a fraction of that kind of security. Her own financial struggles were constant. Between rent, utilities, and supplies for her art, there was little left for anything else. One afternoon, as they finished cleaning the final room, a charming guest bedroom with floral wallpaper, Eleanor turned to Grace. "Do you ever think about what you'd do if money weren't an issue?" Eleanor asked. Grace paused, surprised by the question. "I think I'd focus on my art," she admitted. "I'd love to create full-time, maybe even open a small studio. But for now, I'm just taking things one day at a time." Eleanor smiled thoughtfully. "You remind me so much of my younger self. I worked hard to make ends meet when I first started teaching. I understand what it's like to have big dreams and limited means. Grace shrugged, trying to downplay her struggles. It's not so bad. Helping you has been a blessing in itself. But Eleanor's expression grew serious. You've given me more than you realize, Grace. You've restored my home and my spirit. I haven't felt this alive in years. Grace didn't know how to respond. To her, helping Eleanor was simply the right thing to do. She hadn't expected anything in return, nor had she ever considered how deeply her actions had impacted Eleanor. As she walked home that evening, Grace's mind was a whirl of thoughts. Eleanor's wealth was a revelation, but it didn't change the essence of who she was: kind, humble, and grateful. Grace couldn't help but admire her even more. Little did she know, Eleanor had already begun to plan a gesture that would leave Grace speechless. For Eleanor, it wasn't just about repaying a kindness. It was about honoring the bond they had formed and the hope that Grace had unknowingly brought back into her life. As winter settled over Willow Lane, the bond between Grace and Eleanor grew stronger. Eleanor's house was now more than a place to live. It was a vibrant, inviting home once again. The once dusty corners sparkled, and the air felt lighter, filled with warmth and the faint scent of Eleanor's lavender sachets. Grace, despite her own struggles, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The hours she spent helping Eleanor didn't just improve the older woman's life, they brought her a sense of purpose. But as the days grew colder, Grace couldn't ignore the financial pressures looming over her. Her cafe shifts were growing fewer as business slowed during the winter months. Supplies for her art projects were running low, and her rent was due. Even so, she continued to help Eleanor without hesitation. One frosty morning, Eleanor greeted Grace at the door with an unusual request. "Would you mind staying for tea today after we're done? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." "Of course, Mrs. Jensen," Grace said, curious but not pressing. They spent the morning finishing up the last bits of cleaning in the attic. Grace marveled at the old trunks and boxes filled with memories, letters, photographs, and even a few antique toys. Eleanor chuckled as she reminisced, her laughter filling the space like sunlight on a cloudy day. By mid-afternoon, they were seated in the cozy kitchen, sipping tea and nibbling on buttery shortbread cookies Eleanor had baked the night before. "Grace," Eleanor began, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "you've given me so much. I've been thinking about how I can truly thank you." Grace shook her head. "Mrs. Jensen, your stories, your kindness, and even this tea are thanks enough. I didn't help you expecting anything in return." Eleanor reached for Grace's hand, her grip firm yet gentle. "I know that, dear, and that's what makes your kindness so extraordinary. But I've been blessed in ways I never realized until recently, and it's only right that I share some of that with you." From under the table, Eleanor pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box and slid it across to Grace. "This is for you," she said. Grace hesitated. "Mrs. Jensen, you didn't have to." "Please, Grace," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Just open it." Grace carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a simple envelope inside. She opened it to find a check made out to her name for $5,000. Her hands trembled as she stared at the number, disbelief flooding her. I can't accept this," Grace stammered. "It's too much." Eleanor smiled warmly. "It's not too much, Grace. It's a small token compared to everything you've done for me. I had no idea I had this money, but now that I do, I want it to mean something. And helping you pursue your dreams is the best way I can think to honor what you've done for me." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. She had never imagined receiving such a gift, especially from someone as humble as Eleanor. "This will change so much for me," she whispered. "Thank you, Mrs. Jensen. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have, my dear," Eleanor said. "You gave me back my home and my spirit. This is the least I can do to give you back a little of what you've given me." That evening, Grace returned to her apartment, the check safely tucked away in her bag. She sat at her small desk, staring at the art supplies Eleanor had given her weeks earlier. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to dream without limitations. The $5,000 wouldn't solve all of her problems, but it was enough to ease her immediate burdens and invest in her art. She could finally afford better materials and even set up a small workspace to create her designs. As she picked up her sketchpad and began to draw, Grace thought of Eleanor's words and the profound kindness behind them. Helping Eleanor had never been about money or rewards. It had been about making a difference. But now, that difference was coming full circle, offering her a chance to chase the dreams she had always held close to her heart. Little did she know, Eleanor's gesture was only the beginning of the opportunities that lay ahead. The days after Eleanor's generous gift felt surreal to Grace. With the check safely deposited, she carefully planned how to make the most of the windfall. She caught up on her rent, bought much-needed art supplies, and rented a small, shared studio space in town. It wasn't extravagant, but for the first time in years, Grace felt like she could breathe. Her days at the cafe became lighter too. Knowing she had some financial cushion made every shift less stressful, and when she wasn't working, Grace poured her energy into her art. She sketched endlessly, experimenting with new techniques and styles, her heart bursting with inspiration. One crisp afternoon, as she sat at her new drafting table, her phone buzzed. It was Eleanor. "Grace, dear, would you come by later today? I have something to show you," she said warmly. "Of course, Mrs. Jensen," Grace replied. When Grace arrived at Eleanor's house, she noticed something new immediately. The piano in the living room had been dusted and polished to a gleaming finish. A delicate vase of fresh flowers rested on top, and a sheet of music lay open on the stand. "Mrs. Jensen, it looks wonderful," Grace said, smiling. Eleanor beamed. "I've been practicing a little," she admitted. "Your encouragement gave me the push I needed. It feels good to play again." Grace was thrilled to see Eleanor rediscovering her own passions. As they sat down for tea, Eleanor handed Grace a small folder. "What's this?" Grace asked, opening it. Inside were a series of documents, a formal thank you letter from a local charity, and photos of smiling children holding colorful books. "I've started using some of the money to help others," Eleanor explained. "These children needed new books and supplies for their school. It felt right to pay forward the kindness you've shown me." Grace felt her heart swell. "That's incredible, Mrs. Jensen. Those children are so lucky to have you looking out for them." Eleanor shook her head. "It's not just me, Grace. You reminded me of the joy in giving. Seeing how much you've done with so little inspired me to do more with what I have." The conversation left Grace feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that kindness had a ripple effect, creating change far beyond what she could see. A few months later, Grace's art studio held its first open house. She had worked tirelessly to create a series of pieces inspired by Eleanor's stories and the transformative power of compassion. Vibrant canvases filled the room, each one depicting scenes of connection, growth, and hope. Eleanor, of course, was the guest of honor. She arrived in a dress Grace had helped her pick out, her eyes sparkling with pride as she walked through the studio. "I don't know how to thank you," Grace said, hugging her tightly. "You already have," my dear, Eleanor replied, her voice filled with warmth. "Every stroke of paint, every line on these canvases, it's a testament to the beauty of your spirit. I'm so proud of you." The open house was a success, drawing interest from local art lovers and even a gallery owner who expressed interest in showcasing Grace's work. As the evening wound down, Grace and Eleanor sat together, watching as visitors admired the art. "Do you remember what you asked me about once?" Eleanor said, her voice soft. Grace tilted her head. "What's that?" "What you'd do if money weren't an issue," Eleanor replied. "You said you'd focus on your art. And now look at you. You're living your dream, Grace." Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "It wouldn't have been possible without you, Mrs. Jensen. Your kindness changed everything for me." Eleanor reached for Grace's hand. "And your kindness changed everything for me too, dear." That's the beauty of it. We lift each other up. In that moment, Grace realized how far they had both come. Eleanor had rediscovered joy and purpose, and Grace had found a way to pursue her dreams. Together, they had proven that kindness was a force that could transform lives, creating a cycle of giving that would continue to ripple outward. As the night faded and the studio emptied, Grace and Eleanor walked out into the crisp air, their hearts full. Neither of them knew what the future held, but they were certain of one thing: they had found not just a neighbor, but a lifelong friend. And in that friendship, they had discovered a wealth far greater than money.